Hello, BookTube. It's the 1st of November, as you may have noticed, and that means the first day of a major BookTube event, Nonfiction November, hosted by Gemma at Nonfic Books and Olive at Book Olive, a month-long celebration of nonfiction in which they urge you to read some nonfiction if you don't ever read it, and to read more if you read some. They justify the big cheer of nonfiction by what I think is a legitimate observation, which is that nonfiction has a bad rap. It's largely considered by a lot of readers, even adventurous and limber-minded readers, as boring, as dry, something they don't want to do, something that they want to avoid. I myself think that this is largely a byproduct of nonfiction being taught poorly in schools, people being exposed to it poorly when they have no choice in what they're reading. But it's a wonderland of things to read, and I want to make a little video as a pep talk for Nonfiction November, for those of you who might be on the fence about whether or not to dive in, that for this month, why don't you try what I'm trying? Take the overall woof and weave of your reading landscape and shift it to 90% nonfiction, just for the month of November. So I would assume most of you, the emphasis is 90% at least fiction, with only 10% nonfiction. And then there are some people that maintain a 50-50 balance, and then there are people like me where I read a lot more nonfiction than fiction anyway. And in the month of November, this November, I've cleared my schedule and moved things around a bit so that 90% of my reading will be nonfiction. I'll still be reading mass market romances and mass market science fiction, and I will of course be reading any fiction that I'm being paid to review. But otherwise, all nonfiction for the month of November, and I urge you to try the same thing. Once you do, I think you'll, if you pick the right books, and there's loads and loads of recommendations out there, just type in Nonfiction November TBR, and you will have a day's worth of videos to watch, because the event it gets bigger every year. But if you pick the right books, and if you give it a good square try, I think when the month is over, you'll want to maintain a much closer balance between fiction and nonfiction if you don't go over to it completely. And one of the reasons that I think that, I was reminded of this morning, I got an email this morning from someone who said that she originally swore off nonfiction after school, and only recently came back to reconsidering reading it for pleasure. And that, as she put it in her email, the fact that she hadn't done that before was kind of silly, because don't we all love museum exhibits? Don't we all watch documentaries and love them? Who didn't watch Planet Earth and love it? Who hasn't watched Vikings on the History Channel and loved it? In other words, the point I wanted to make in this Nonfiction November sort of pep talk is to point out to you that you are already a huge fan of nonfiction. The books, some of them, may have left a bad taste in your mouth because of how you were taught in school, but you are already a huge fan of nonfiction. In fact, you prefer it to fiction. Whether you know it or not, you do. Picture the scenario. You've just arrived at an airport and everyone is talking. Something dramatic has just happened. You're asking people and you're sort of eavesdropping to figure out what the story is. It turns out that the story is that a toddler got away from her parents while they were preoccupied at boarding and somehow got out onto the tarmac. And everyone was watching, including her parents, horrified from the windows, while these enormous planes lumbered over her head and she just wandered around, too much interested in her surroundings to be scared, but still in mortal danger. Imagine you get to the airport and that story is floating around. And you have two choices. In Lounge A, there's a guy saying, I don't know anything about that story other than the stuff that you're hearing as well, but I have crafted a wonderful story about it. And in Lounge B, there's a person saying, I saw it all. I went out onto the tarmac and I myself rescued the little girl and walked her back. Which one are you going to go and listen to? There is no doubt. There will be no hesitation in your mind. The person in the first terminal will be alone. The person in the second terminal will have a large crowd spellbound on every word. Picture the last historical novel that you read. Like, for instance, if you're one of the many thousands of people who read Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, when you were finished with it, what's the very first thing that you wanted to know? How much of it was true? The very first thing you thought when you finished that historical novel or any other captivating historical novel was not, boy, oh boy, I wished I could get the author to elaborate on her metaphors. No, the first thing you think in a situation like that is, I wonder how much of this is true. Those reactions signal something. They are worth paying attention to. They signal that we want to know the true story. We want to know the facts every bit as much as we want to know the fantasies. More so, I think. What you have to realize in Nonfiction November is that it takes a little bit of a little wrench of the mind to recover that. It's so easy to read fiction. It's so easy to just lounge into someone's made-up world. And it can be thrilling. Absolutely thrilling. And also mind-expanding. But I would maintain, I realize I'm a bit of a biased person here, I would maintain that it's not as basic, as atavistic a desire as hearing real stories. As hearing different versions of real stories and comparing them or whatnot, as finding out what happened and when and what its effects were. I think that's more interesting. But even if you think that it's as interesting, an even playing field, nevertheless, I want to remind you that you yourself, every day, show a personal urge for nonfiction. It's not this alien type of writing that you're going to dip your toe into in Nonfiction November, but that you usually avoid. That isn't true. If you have a choice between someone's fantasy about subject X and a well-reported, well-sourced account of subject X, you might enjoy the fantasy, but you will definitely want the account. So, if that helps any, I always try to make 2 points to people. One is that you already love nonfiction, and you're already drawn to it. And 2 is that that feeling of being left behind by nonfiction, that feeling of coming to a work of nonfiction on the evolution of horses or the Battle of Lepanto or whatever, and feeling I don't know enough about this subject to read about it, I feel left out. I feel too far behind the 8 ball to jump on board this book and read it. That feeling has an analog in reading fiction. And a point that I always try to make to people who are leery about nonfiction is that it's the same thing. When you come to a massive Brandon Sanderson epic fantasy, you likewise start encountering right away all sorts of things that you don't immediately understand because the author is world building. And the world building is being disseminated to you briefly in installments, and you have to do a little scrambling to catch up, or maybe a lot of scrambling to catch up. But for some reason, when it comes to reading, fans of huge epic fantasies or whatever, books like that, have no problem feeling behind the 8 ball when it comes to that kind of world building. But when it comes to a history of the Panama Canal, all of a sudden they're saying, well, no, I should probably do some preliminary research before I read this book. No, you don't need to do that. If a nonfiction author is doing their job, you'll never feel that way. You will be caught up. By the time you get a third or even a quarter of the way into the book, you won't feel the need. You won't feel behind the 8 ball anymore. You will feel informed. And then you can move forward to finish that account and read some other account on the same subject. And if the author doesn't make you feel that way, it's their fault. It's not your fault, and it's not the genre's fault. It's their fault. They're just a poor nonfiction writer. Same thing with a fiction writer who makes you feel behind the 8 ball for a massive amount of world building, and then a quarter of the way in, you start to get a clearer sense of the built world, and it's bad. It's poorly constructed. If you got to that point in an epic fantasy, for instance, you wouldn't say, oh, epic fantasy is just not for me. No, you would say this author is poor at epic fantasy. Okay, fine. So if you're reading a nonfiction work on whatever, the natural history of spiders, suicide attempts in Niagara Falls, whatever, and you're a quarter of the way in and you're starting to get a feel for the subject and you like how the author is helping you along, then you found a good nonfiction author. And there are many recommendations that can help you. I can help you, and so can all those videos that I mentioned. So that's what this video is for, really to encourage you. If you've seen all these Nonfiction November videos in your feed, and you're wondering if maybe you want to participate, do. Give it a try. Read lots of nonfiction in November. I mean, Olive and Gemma are very generous. They say, you know, all you have to do is read one nonfiction book and you're part of Nonfiction November. And that's true, but let's give it the old college try. Why not read a lot of nonfiction in November? And cast your net wide and see what of it you like. Feel free to ask for recommendations. I'm happy to make them. But let's keep in mind that in that airport terminal, presented with the options between fiction and nonfiction, everyone would pick nonfiction. That speaks to its power. It's not nonfiction's fault if it was taught wrong to you, and it's not nonfiction's fault if you were given bad examples of it and forced to read them and do book reports on them. There's plenty more out there. So anyway, this is sort of a video to encourage you and to celebrate Nonfiction November, when we'll be seeing a lot of nonfiction on this channel. So I'll wrap this up for now and we'll get to that. Thank you, BookTube.